When this video card showed up online for $10, I knew I had to have it. You see, this HD7790 is an interesting mix of old and new, and it is the only DirectX fixture level 12 that I know of that has just 1GB of VRAM. This weird mix got me wondering, is this old GCN2 card actually useful today? The reason why GPU-Z fails to show the current GPU frequency or its pixel rate in the left side of the screen is due to AMD's last driver package release for legacy GCN cards, Adrenaline 22.6.1. And that says a lot about the quality of said driver, considering that the previous version, 21.5.1, seen on the right side, doesn't have this problem. It's not just the 1GB of VRAM that got my attention, it's also the DirectX feature level support of 12.0 and the TDP of just 85 watts. You see, the Boner XT GPU was then reused on the later R7-60X, but for that one AMD pushed the TDP to 115 watts, that is 30 watts more than the previous iteration, in an attempt to squeeze out as much performance as possible. This is what panic smells like. But 85 watts does not require a fancy thermal solution. Gigabyte opted for an enhanced variant of the Intel stock cooler. The heatsink is still solid aluminum, but definitely better looking than your typical aluminum floor, and the fan on top is fairly large. As a result, the car's temperature stabilizes at about 63 C in heaven for a delta over ambient of 38 degrees. The card was tested using a Ryzen 5 3600 base system, with 32GB of DDR4 at 3000 MHz running in dual channel. We did collect some data for the R7-60X as well. Its larger VRAM will allow the GPU to get more performance, and we'll highlight this in the relevant cases. Now, because of that 12.0 feature level support that this card has, the HD7790 can launch newer games like Marvel Rivals, unlike the previously reviewed GTX 750 Ti. But that's only a theoretical victory because for all practical purposes, the game crashes shortly after launch. 1GB just ain't gonna cut it. Cyberpunk is playable, or at least it can benchmark at 720 resolution and the low settings. Basically start from low, leave FSR on and then drag every other option to its minimum. The HD7790 got 45 FPS on average and 31-41% lows. And you, my dear PC gamer using such a card, you got yourself two appointments, one for the ophthalmologist, the other one for the optometrist. Once you see the number for the finals, you'll understand why I opted for the quick cache tutorial. While the 50 FPS for the average is fine for the more casual players, almost 40 is almost good for an almost neutral KD ratio. And you get to experience all that at a glorious 720 resolution and low settings. Robocop took pity on our card and simply refused to launch. But this is no surprise, we got a similar error with the much beefier R9-290X that shares the same GCN2 architecture as the HD7790. Fortnite stays surprisingly playable at all tested resolutions. Granted, I used the performance rendering mode and all settings to their minimum, except the draw distance, that one was set too far. The tiny GCN2 card averaged between almost 100 FPS at 1080 resolution and almost 160 at 720. The 1% range between 75 FPS and 112. The experience was fine. Terminator Resistance is an older Unreal Engine 4 title, so the HD7790 can provide a decent experience. 1080 resolution and medium settings has the game averaging at 45 FPS with 1% loss at 35. This is not a fast-paced title, so the experience is good enough to allow you to focus on the game and story. I was pleasantly surprised by how Counter-Strike 2 played at low settings, after the first couple of minutes of stuttering at each shot fired. After all resources loaded, at 1080 resolution the card managed 88 FPS on average and more importantly 72 FPS for the 1% lows. This improves as resolution drops, reaching a maximum of 133 FPS for the average and 102 FPS for the 1% lows. Despite Far Cry 6 desperately trying to tell me that it needs 2.6GB of VRAM at 720 resolution and low settings, I did press the benchmark button. The gap between the average FPS and the 1% and 0.1% lows is very small, making for a very stable slideshow if anything. In the case of Apex Legends, the game can be played by hardware in this category of performance once the DirectX feature level barrier is crossed. And unlike Marvel Rivals, the game is playable at 69 average FPS and 52 41% lows. Sorta playable. And just at 720 resolution. I bet by now you're glad you kept wearing the glasses the doctor prescribed earlier. Doom Eternal also crashed, but in this case I don't think the Vulkan support was the issue, rather the 1GB of VRAM. You see, the 2GB R72060X not only managed to launch the game, but also to perform acceptably at 720 resolution and low settings, providing an average FPS of 82 and a 1% loss of 61. If the results in Rainbow Six Siege seem odd to you, well, this is the result of the VRAM limitations on the HD7790 card. Despite using the low settings, only the 720 resolution and 50% render scale managed to keep the VRAM usage under the 1GB available on the card. This allowed it to hit 94 FPS on average and 59-41% lows. Every other settings combination that failed to get the VRAM usage under 1GB, even by a measly 20 MB or so, ended up with hilariously bad results. The 2GB variants, be them 7790s or the relabeled R72060Xs, do a lot better, with all resolutions being playable, though the results at 1080p resolution and 100% render scale are mediocre for a multiplayer title. But even so, the 50% uplift in performance is dramatic at the 720 resolution and 50% render scale, where the 7790 had a fighting chance. I was shocked by the performance difference in control for just switching the rendering API. Unlike the RX 580, where the performance was pretty much the same when using either of the APIs, the HD7790 favors DirectX 11, where it got 58 FPS on average and 31-41% lows. This is at 720 resolution and low settings. Same settings, but using the DirectX 12 API has the card dropping to 31 FPS for the average and 20-41% lows, so stick to the -DirectX 11.1 command line switch. And yes, one extra gigabyte of VRAM would have helped. The R72060X gets 16 more FPS for the average and the 1% low stays at a comfortable 57 FPS, almost twice of what the 7790 got. Much like Fortnite, Overwatch 2 ran fine at low settings at all three tested resolutions. The average FPS ranged between almost 100 at 1080 resolution and almost 200 at 720 resolution. The 1% lows followed a similar pattern as the resolution dropped, ranging between 78 and 166. Nothing really new here, the game will run fine on a potato, and the HD7790 is quite rich in starch. Much like with Doom Eternal, Resident Evil 4 crashed. And yes, this was due to the limited amount of VRAM. That extra gigabyte allowed the sibling card to launch and perform almost okay at 720 resolution at the prioritized performance preset, with 47 FPS on average and 27-41% lows. Though Tattoo is hardly GPU intensive at low settings at 1080 resolution, despite the resolution scaling being set back to 100%. Even the HD7790 manages to get the game running CPU limited, so the average of 129 FPS and the 1% loss of 66 are more relevant to the Ryzen 5 rather than the video card. Between all resolution and settings combination tested, I'll go for 1080 lowest when playing Shadow of the Tomb Raider. 38 FPS for the average and 30-41% lows? Okay for 1GB GPU, granted in a rather old AAA title. 1600x900 low settings has the 1% lows dipping slightly under 30, and so the 720 resolution and medium settings. 720 and low settings is the only other combination that has the 1% lows above 30 FPS, but at this point I'd stick to 1080 lowest and get rid of the glasses. There are quite a few resolutions where Borderlands 3 stays playable, and just like with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, my advice is to stay on the higher resolution side. You'll get an average FPS on the 40s with the 1% lows in the 30s at 1080 resolution and very low settings, 900p low settings and 720 medium. 720 resolution and low settings this time around will get the average close to 60 and the 1% lows in the 40s, but the drop in pixel count is significant. The 1GB variant of the HD7790 is a funny potato to play with. Having feature level 12.0 managed to keep it as a viable option for some of the games who decided to drop support for DirectX 11. And I'm looking at you, Respawn Entertainment. But 12.0 support is not a silver bullet, as Control illustrated that quite painfully, and like Robocop showed, it might not mean anything at all. The 1GB variant of the HD7790 is still a potato. Fun to play with, but still limited by that 1GB VRAM, and this was obvious when Doom Eternal didn't launch, or when Rainbow Six Siege switched from PowerPoint to an actual game only when the VRAM usage dropped low enough. I paid $10 for my sample, and I'd call that a fair price for a card that allows you to play Fortnite, CS2, and pretty much all easier to run esport titles. If you happen to have one, sure, have fun using it. As for buying one, do it only because you're a GCN2 fanatic, and even then, make sure you're not overpaying. The card relies on legacy to support drivers, and AMD did a pretty crappy job with its last driver package. If anything, keep an eye on the 2GB variants, including the R7-260X. Those are GCN2 as well. Anyway, as fun as it was, we're done with the HD7790. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked it.